Hello. Good morning. How you doing? Doing good? Welcome to 9:36, the peak learning hour of the day. The slow descent into that energy minima between the time you last ate and you will next eat or eat. So I will try to keep this concise and moving along. Because many of you may not know very much about me, I thought I'd tell you just a couple quick things about myself. I'm Andrew Zolli. I run an organization called PopTech. We bring together many kinds of innovators to collaborate at the intersections between disciplines and practices. Our view of the world is that we live in a world of silos of excellence, in which the public health people talk to public health people, and within the world of public health, say, the neglected and infectious tropical disease folks talk to those folks, and so on and so forth. And as we drill through those silos, we frequently find innovations that were invented in one area that may have transformational impact in another. But issues of language, issues of practice, process, culture, all of those things matter enormously. So we are building networks that are horizontal, complementary networks from within which we can source new innovations. In addition to that, I serve as one of the explorers of the National Geographic Society. I'm part of their Big and Tall program, where they fit fat men into submarines to the bottom of the ocean. Some of you may have read recently that James Cameron went to the bottom of the Mariana Trench. I did not go with him because I float. I just, as was mentioned, finished writing a book on resilience, which is what I'm going to talk to you about this morning a little bit. Be coming out everywhere July 10th. I'll actually have a way for you guys to get this is like the first time I'm really talking about this in front of anybody. But there's a really cool way to get the first chapter of the book. I'll show you at the end. Okay, so go check out poptech.org. Literally thousands of hours of amazing presentations on breakthrough innovations, many of them directly relevant to the world of public health at poptech.org. Now, I want to tell you a story. Okay. This story is a story from Mexico City. The date line is January 2008. As the sun rises high in the sky, the day begins. Families getting ready for the day. The sounds of sort of domestic life, a city coming to life. People beginning to move through the city. Groups of people begin to gather in one of the major squares in Mexico City. First by the dozens, and then by the hundreds, and then by the thousands. And they hold above their heads not protest signs, though they began to really seriously get agitated, and not weapons, but ears of corn. Why? Well, these would become known eventually as the tortilla riots. These are food riots happening in Mexico City, because the price of corn, which is a basic food staple in the country that first domesticated corn, has risen 400%, and in a matter of a few weeks, and in a country where you have 40% of the population at or near the poverty line, a shift in the pricing of a basic staple like this is not just a potential political crisis, it's a potential humanitarian crisis. Now, why did this happen? The activists, the citizens who were shouting and beginning to create protest movements throughout the city. They blamed big ranchers, big business, the government, all the kind of usual suspects. But most of them did not know that the reason that the price of corn had skyrocketed started not with those bad actors, but with this event, Hurricane Katrina, which several years before, 2.5 years before, had shut down the 2,900 oil rigs that dot the Gulf Coast, along the Gulf Coast, and caused a price spike in the price of gasoline. And it made the price of ethanol, which is a comparative fuel, look relatively cheap by comparison, which further fueled an investment bubble into ethanol, accelerated by our own Congress. We just heard about the role that politics plays in creating social change. Well, our Congress decided that we were going to see a 5-fold increase in ethanol production, 40% of it to come from corn. And so there was a huge shift among American growers of corn, away from the corn that you and I buy at the supermarket, and toward the kinds that are good for producing this kind of fuel. And in an age of NAFTA that connects two really important things. First, the speculative markets and the food system. the global trade system between these countries, something really interesting started to happen. As this shift happened, the price of corn and the price of oil began to move in lockstep. Here's what the curves look like. Well, you can see them over there. Corn in green and oil in blue. Now look over to the right-hand side and you'll start to see the two curves start to move radically in lockstep. Right after this happened, there was a speculative bubble in the oil markets, and the price of oil skyrocketed. The price of corn went along with it, and what we saw in Mexico City was this. Now just consider for a moment what is true about this story. First of all, you see the interlinking of the ecological system, the economic system, the food security system, the global trade system, the political system, and poverty systems across multiple countries in ways that are impossible to predict. I guarantee you, nobody was thinking the day that Katrina hit the Gulf Coast what the implications might be 2 years later for campesinos in Mexico City. Nobody. And that is because in an era of globalization, we have tied together systems with radically different time signatures, with many different kinds of impacts on the planet that move at all different kinds of speeds, in all kinds of different geographies. We created a world that is impossible to predict. And it's made worse by the fact that we bring to the entire effort of thinking about the future a really crappy piece of equipment, namely the one between our ears. And I can demonstrate it for you very simply. These are two pictures of what people at the beginning of the 20th century thought life might look like here at the beginning of the 21st. As you can see, they thought we'd be living in giant electrical transformers, or that we'd be rolling our whole town over to Grandma's house in one of the most schizophrenic relationships with the natural world you could possibly imagine. They did get the tagline right, though, trade your trouble for a bubble. Right? So they knew one part of what we did. So, were these people stupid? No. They're no smarter than we are. Human intelligence has not taken a giant leap forward in the last 100 years. No, what's going on here is a simple cognitive bias that all of us bring to thinking about the future. When we make images of the future, frequently what we do is we take the dominant fact of the present, the newest fact in the present, we make it the dominant fact in the future. So what was going on then was the electrification of the home and the rise of mass transportation. So what's the future going to look like? It's going to look like those two trends taken to their radical extreme. Right? We're going to be rolling everything everywhere. We're going to be living in electrical power plants. And I can give you an even better example. In 1977, there were exactly 4 members of the International Brotherhood of Professional Elvis Impersonators. Now, it takes a certain gonadal circumference, let's say, to call yourself the International anything when you have 4 members, and they all live on the same block in Las Vegas. But with a lot of chapter and outreach efforts, today there are more than 35,000 male and female. Give it up for the sisters. You know who you are. Male and female members of the International Union of Professional Elvis Impersonators, and at this rate, by 2050, 1 in 3 people on Earth is going to be an impersonator. You have got to get ready. Now, even more damning than this is that we have a myth, right, that we see all forms of change. Now, we're going to do a little exercise together, and I want you to watch, and I'm going to flash 2 images on the screen. Okay, I want you to look at the 2 images, and I'm going to tell you there's only one difference between them. Okay, just one. Now, study the images as they flash, and when you notice what the difference is, raise your hand. Don't shout it out. Just raise your hand up in the air. Okay, you ready? All right, here we go. There's one person. 2, 3, 4, 5. It's easier up there. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now, here's what I want to ask you. I gave you about 20 seconds to find one difference. How many people here honestly did not see the difference? And by the way, I would put myself in that category. First time I saw this, I did not see the difference. What I'd like you to pay attention to is this. The thing holding the plane in the sky. Flickers at a rate that is neuroscientifically difficult It's a perceptual bias. And it has its reflection in real-world problems. Here are two risks we read about in the newspaper all the time. Over here we have the bad dude risk, right? Men with facial hair, clearly a problem. Over here you have the disappearance of the largest glacier inside Patagonia, inside of a single human lifetime. That is 1929, and that is the present. Now, according to a big think tank, we did a head-to-head health risk comparison of your individual personal risk of being affected by these two particular issues. Here are your health risks associated with these issues. Over here on the right, on the left, excuse me, your chances of being directly affected by the threat of terrorism in your person, in your lifetime, about 1 in 28 million, and we spend trillions of dollars to go after it. And I'm not here to argue that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's just a thing. Your chance of being affected by climate change in your lifetime, about 1 in 6. And yet we can't even get our leaders to have a meeting when they're having a meeting. They're actually there to have a meeting, they won't stand in the same room. It's like na-na-na-na-boo-boo on a global scale. Why is that? Because our ancestors' brains, which we all inherited, are designed to deal very exquisitely with threats that are embodied, that have a face, that break a sense of moral taboo, and that conform to narratives, that conform to stories. So, the killing of innocents in the name of fanaticism, we've got to do something, right? The mass collusion and vacation of responsibility, abdication of responsibility by us, collectively as a planet, though made more complex by the interaction of many different actors, very, very hard for us to deal with. For instance, what's the #1 killer of Americans every year? Heart disease. Kills millions of Americans. We do not have an international war on cheeseburgers. Thank God. Because I would become Canadian and I would screw up the entire social order with my presence there. So what does this do? In an era in which we have increased intrinsic volatility and an imperfect ability to see even the present, we are seeing a fundamental shift away from sustainability, away from risk mitigation, and toward an era of resilience and risk adaptation. And it's happening across the board in economics, in public health, in energy systems and energy security. It's happening in international development. The folk, I just came from a gathering at the Rockefeller Foundation where they're betting that basically half their investments in the future are going to be focused on resilience, the ability of ensuring that systems can absorb shocks and disruptions. Now what's interesting is I've spent the last 3 years going from the coral reefs of Palau to the backstreets of Palestine, neuroscience labs, and all kinds of places in between, looking at the emerging heuristics of resilient systems. And before I tell you about them, I just want to tell you 3 things that resilience is not. The first one is it's not robustness. It's not hardening systems. The pyramids are very long-lasting, but if you knock them over, they won't put themselves back together again. Resilience is also not found in redundancy. You can have an extra system, but the carrying cost of the extra system is often very high. It imposes a real cost on an organism, on an ecosystem, on an enterprise, on a nation, on a social system. And ultimately, it's not fundamentally about being wealthy, although reserves help, and redundancy helps, and robustness all help. They are not quite the same thing as a system that is able to reconfigure itself, to sense threats and disruptions and restructure in the face of them, to do what we think of as a kind of jazz-like improvisation, rehearsed improvisation. And what we find in the resilience conversation is basically there's a set of design principles that are emerging at the systems end. That people are thinking about public health and economics and new technologies. These are the kind of systems conversations, and there's a pattern language of design that we're going to see applied to our social enterprises and our social innovators and whatever the most generic term, as you can hear from the last presentation, we'll use for them. How do we design systems that have the right kinds of feedbacks, that can decouple from scarce resources when needed, that have the right kind of internal diversity, that harness kind of self-reorganization and localism? That's on the system side. On the social side, there's another conversation happening, and that's this one, which is about the dynamics of people, communities, organizations. and how they become resilient. And that has to do with mindsets and beliefs and values and cooperation and the health of social networks, the intrinsic health of communities, and important new leadership characteristics like a term I won't get into today called translational leadership, which is strongly related to translational medicine. It actually emerged out. And increasingly what we're going to see is these two ends of the spectrum coming together in a kind of pattern language of systems design. And this is the agenda now. Right? People have asked for a long time, what's going to replace sustainability? And I think what's interesting is the sustainability regime has been with us for a long time. And here's what's happening. Let's pick a big threat like climate change. Imagine for a moment that we take all the people who care about climate change, working on it, trying to make a dent in the problem. We put them in a car, and we send that car careening toward the cliff of irrevocable climate disruption, a critical threshold beyond which the cliff, there is no return. In the early stages, as the car is moving, the people in the car who have the moral authority all say things like, stop, turn around, turn the wheel. In the dynamics of the actual conversation, they say, don't build another coal-fired power plant. And they're right. That's the moral and appropriate thing to say. But as the universe ignores them, and it has ignored them, and as the car gets closer and closer to the cliff, another group of people come to moral prominence. Those are the folks who say things like, we'd better put an airbag and some parachutes on this thing, because we could go over the cliff at any moment, and there's some vulnerable people in the car who frankly didn't put themselves in it. We put them in it. And we owe it to them to make sure that we can help them survive. This is the world of sustainability. This is increasingly the world of resilience. And across many different complex systems, we're seeing a huge kind of structural convergence, maybe the most important one that will happen, in the kind of decades. We're talking about decades. This is a once in a 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 year kind of shift. Okay. So I don't have a lot of time this morning, and there's so many amazing people on it, so I'm really going to stick to time. But I wanted to leave you, if I can, with these two really quick stories. One is about ways in which we're learning from public health how to apply principles of public health to change in ways that no longer belong to the traditional narratives of public health, but belong broadly to the world. In order to do that, I want to talk about risk, and I want to tell you a story from the dawn of the automobile age. And when the automobile first came to Britain, it was driving along roads with no rules. They weren't really designed for cars. The roads had been there for a long time. And it was popular in Victorian Britain to have very high privacy hedges. This was Lord Krusty Bottom's estate. And what he was doing was he was doing you a favor by ensuring that you were unlikely to see his extraordinary level of opulence and die from a heart arrhythmia or something like that. Right? So this is a Victorian notion of privacy. And there was a movement because cars were driving like Luke Skywalker down the Death Star and crashing into each other at the corners to cut down these hedges. And a letter appeared in the Times of London from Lord Krusty Bottom. He said, listen, before any of you do this, I just want to tell you what happened. We in my community cut down our hedges so that automobiles could see where they were going, and what do you think happened to the accident rate? Well, this is what happened. First of all, everything was covered in dust, and the accident rate went up. We made the system safer, and what happened? People drove faster. That's right. They compensated for the presence of the safety system by moving their level of risk up. Some of you may have more recently seen an example of this behavior somewhere on the American highway. And you could just as easily put a guy in this picture. We've decided that it's okay to eat and drive and surf the internet, and talk to our friends, and work, and clothe. That was the one I saw. Literally, someone dressing themselves in the driver's seat coming up 95 from New York this morning. And this pattern's been repeated a lot. Anti-lock brake systems, for instance, installed in the Netherlands had no appreciable impact on the accident rates for taxis because the taxis changed their driving habits and drove faster and broke later. That's particularly cruelly been a problem for bicycle helmet laws. Bicycle helmet laws did not have the scope of impact because while they're very good for bicyclists to be wearing a helmet if you get knocked off your bicycle, if you're biking along and fall over, what happened was it sent a signal to drivers that the bicyclists were safer than they were. So, if a typical New Yorker, you see a bicyclist wearing a helmet, you speed up because, they're probably going to live. And this led to a famous rule in skydiving called Booth's Rule number 2, which says that the safer skydiving equipment becomes, the more risks skydivers will take in order to keep the death rate constant, because that is the purpose of skydiving, to die at a predictable rate. And we know what this looks like when it's summed to the level of organizational culture. It looks like this. BP had one major accident after another for a decade, just not in our particular backyard, because they had a safety culture that said it's really important to wear stickum on your boots while you climb up the rigging of your particular oil rig, but when you get there, it's okay not to cover the oil well with cement. So what do we do about this? Well, this is one of the examples where public health is really starting to fundamentally shift our understanding of how to move norms. And my favorite example of this is an extraordinary organization that we at PopTech work very closely with called Ceasefire, based in Chicago, led by that man in the lower right corner, Gary Sletkin. Gary is an epidemiologist. He started working on HIV in 1981, and I have 1 minute left. Started working on HIV in 1981, came back to Chicago, noticed that, from Uganda working on HIV, noticed that HIV is, that the dynamics of gun violence on the south side of Chicago looked a lot like the epidemiological patterns of the illnesses he was charged with interdicting, and started an organization in which they trained formerly incarcerated senior drug and gang leaders to work on 10 by 10 block grids to interrupt the flow of violence, gun violence, often after the guns have been drawn. They will literally work to do real-time dispute resolution and mediation. And according to this effort, which interrupts the behavior, the specific behavior of the super spreaders, works to change the mindsets of those most likely at risk for transmission and change the broad norms, which are all things we do when we're dealing with a pandemic. They're able to lower the violent crime rate by up to 75% in their first year of operation. That is amazing. And it makes me think about all the other forms of social change that can learn from public health. So I have all kinds of other amazing stuff to tell you, but I can't. So instead, that's my email address. Send me an email. That's me on Twitter. And if you want to get a free chapter of a book that talks about all of this, it's over there. And thanks.